He saved the Union. He ended slavery. He's carved into a mountain. And yet, Abraham Lincoln died with a broken country that he could never fully put back together. Here's the question nobody asks. What if winning the Civil War wasn't actually enough? By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Lincoln, arguably America's greatest president, could never close the wound he spent 4 years fighting to heal. And the answer will surprise you. Welcome back. This channel is about addressing the human mind's most curious puzzles, the ones hiding right beneath the surface of the stories we think we already know. Today we're diving into one of the deepest, Abraham Lincoln and the impossible task of Reconstruction. Here's what we'll cover. We'll look at the political forces working against Lincoln from inside his own party, the brutal reality of Southern resistance, the economic trap that kept millions of freed people enslaved in all but name, and the fateful moment Lincoln's vision died, not on a battlefield, but in a theater. By the end, you'll see Lincoln not just as a hero, but as a man trapped between a country's highest ideals and its darkest instincts. Let's get into it. Let's start with the most basic assumption people make, that winning a war means winning the peace. It doesn't. When Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, roughly 260,000 Confederate soldiers were effectively pardoned and sent home. No trials, no formal punishments, no process of accounting. These weren't men who had simply lost a football game. Many had watched brothers die. Many had spent 4 years convinced they were fighting for something righteous, and almost none of them woke up the next morning believing they were wrong. Here's a telling example. Within weeks of the war's end, Southern state legislatures began passing what became known as the Black Codes, laws specifically designed to restrict the rights of newly freed Black Americans. Mississippi passed laws that essentially forced freedmen to sign labor contracts or be arrested for vagrancy. Louisiana required Black workers to stay on plantations and forfeit wages if they left early. Lincoln saw this coming. He knew that military victory without cultural transformation would be temporary. But transforming 4 million people's deeply held beliefs about race, hierarchy, and power? That doesn't happen in a presidential term. Takeaway for this section? Military surrender and social surrender are two completely different things. Lincoln won the first. The second was barely even begun. Now here's something that genuinely shocks most people. One of Lincoln's biggest obstacles wasn't Confederate rebels. It was his own Republican Party. By 1864, a powerful faction called the Radical Republicans, led by figures like Senator Charles Sumner and Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, had a fundamentally different vision for Reconstruction than Lincoln did. Lincoln's plan, known as the 10% plan, was relatively lenient. If just 10% of a Southern state's voters swore a loyalty oath and accepted the end of slavery, that state could rejoin the Union. Lincoln wanted reconciliation. He literally quoted, "Malice toward none, charity for all," in his second inaugural address. The Radical Republicans thought that was dangerously naive. And honestly, they had a point. They pushed through the Wade-Davis bill in 1864, which required 50% of voters, not 10, to take a loyalty oath, and demanded far stronger protections for Black citizens. Lincoln pocket vetoed it, essentially killing it without a signature. The radicals were furious. Senator Benjamin Wade publicly accused Lincoln of being a dictator. Thaddeus Stevens called his Reconstruction plan absurd. The tension was real, it was personal, and it was paralyzing. Here's the mini case study that makes this real: Louisiana. Lincoln had already started rebuilding Louisiana under his 10% plan by early 1865. A new state government was forming. But Congress refused to seat Louisiana's new representatives because they said the plan hadn't done enough to protect Black voting rights. Louisiana, a real-world test case, was stalled in political gridlock. Lincoln couldn't move forward because the people who supposedly agreed with him couldn't agree on how to move forward. Takeaway: political unity is just as essential as military victory, and Lincoln had neither in the halls of Congress. Here's the reframe that most history classes skip entirely. We tend to think of Lincoln as the solution to America's division. But consider this. Lincoln was actually a symptom of how divided the country already was. He won the 1860 election with 0 electoral votes from any Southern state. Not a single one. He was, from day one, president of only part of the country. His legitimacy was contested before he even took office. Reuniting America wasn't just a post-war challenge, it was the entire context of his presidency from the very first day. The wound he was trying to heal was one that had been growing for 40 years before the first shot was ever fired. No single man, no matter how gifted, was going to close it in 4 years, or even 8. Let's talk about something even more fundamental than politics. Let's talk about land. After the war, General William T. Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, which set aside 400,000 acres of Confederate land along the South Carolina and Georgia coast to be distributed in 40-acre plots to freed black families. This became the basis of the famous phrase, 40 acres and a mule. For a brief moment, it looked like economic independence for formerly enslaved people might actually happen. Lincoln didn't oppose it, but he also never got to solidify it. Because here's the brutal economic reality Lincoln was navigating. The entire Southern economy ran on plantation agriculture, and plantation agriculture ran on labor. When slavery ended, wealthy Southern landowners still held the land, and they needed workers. Freedmen needed income, but had no land, no tools, and no capital. It created an almost unavoidable trap. Within months of Lincoln's death, President Andrew Johnson reversed Sherman's order. Freedmen were told to return land that had already been distributed to its former Confederate owners. 40 acres became 40 years of sharecropping, a system that kept black families in debt, dependence, and poverty for generations. Even if Lincoln had lived, the political will to redistribute land on a massive scale was almost certainly not there. Property rights were sacrosanct. The economic interests of Northern industrialists, who wanted cheap Southern cotton to keep flowing, were aligned with stability, not justice. Takeaway: political reunification without economic redistribution is a house built on sand. Lincoln understood this, but the forces against it were overwhelming. We can't talk about why Lincoln couldn't reunite America without confronting the most obvious reason. He was murdered before he could try. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln died the following morning. He had been president for exactly 4 years and 41 days. And the man who took over, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, was almost Lincoln's opposite in temperament, philosophy, and political skill. Johnson was a Southern Democrat placed on the Republican ticket purely for symbolic unity during the war. He had no commitment to black civil rights. He clashed bitterly with Congress. He was eventually impeached, the first U.S. president ever to be impeached, by the very radical Republicans Lincoln had struggled to manage. Here's a sobering example: the Freedmen's Bureau. Lincoln helped create this agency in March 1865 to help formerly enslaved people transition to free life, providing food, education, legal aid, and labor contracts. Under Lincoln, it had real momentum. Under Johnson, he repeatedly vetoed its funding. Congress overrode him, but the Bureau was starved of resources and eventually dismantled in 1872, leaving millions of black Americans without the institutional support they desperately needed. Lincoln's death didn't just remove a president. It removed the one man with enough political credibility on both sides to potentially thread the needle of Reconstruction. Takeaway: leadership transitions at critical historical moments don't just change style, they change destiny. Here's the final piece, and maybe the most uncomfortable one. Even if Lincoln had survived, even if Congress had unified, even if land had been redistributed and the Freedmen's Bureau had been fully funded, there was still one force that Lincoln couldn't legislate away: the story America chose to tell about the Civil War. Within decades of the war's end, a powerful cultural narrative emerged in the South, and eventually spread nationally, called the Lost Cause. This mythology reframed the Confederacy not as a treasonous rebellion defending slavery, but as a noble struggle for states' rights and Southern heritage. Confederate monuments were built across the South, most of them erected not immediately after the war, but during the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, as a deliberate message of defiance. By 1900, textbooks in Southern states were literally rewriting what the war was about. Lincoln couldn't fight a myth he hadn't lived to see fully born. And this myth had real consequences. It shaped how generations of Americans understood race, justice, and history. It provided cultural cover for Jim Crow laws. It delayed the civil rights movement by decades. Takeaway: you cannot win a war for the future if your opponent wins the war for the past. So let's bring this all together. Why couldn't Abraham Lincoln ever fully reunite America? It wasn't one reason, it was 5, stacked on top of each other like a wall he was always climbing but never quite scaling. 1. Social wounds don't heal on military timelines. Confederate soldiers went home with their beliefs intact, and Southern legislatures moved immediately to restrict black freedom. 2. His own party blocked him. The radical Republicans wanted something faster and harder than Lincoln's malice toward none approach. The result was gridlock at the exact moment speed mattered most. 3. Economic liberation without land is incomplete liberation. Without property, formerly enslaved people had no foundation for independence, and the political will to give them land simply wasn't there. 4. He was killed before Reconstruction truly began. 5 days after the war ended, Lincoln was gone. Andrew Johnson dismantled nearly everything Lincoln had started, and the window of possibility slammed shut. 5. The myth became more powerful than the history. The Lost Cause rewrote the war, entrenched racial hierarchy, and poisoned American memory for generations. Here's the deepest lesson of all of this. Reconciliation isn't just about ending conflict. It's about building something new in its place. New institutions, new economic relationships, new stories. Lincoln understood this better than almost anyone of his era. But understanding what needs to be done and actually doing it, those are two very different things. And the gap between them? That gap is still with us today.
If this video made you see Lincoln or American history a little differently, I'd love to know what surprised you most. Drop it in the comments. Was it the political gridlock, the lost cause myth, the economics of freedom? And if you want to go deeper on various curious factors that revolve around our life, hit subscribe and stay tuned. We will be back with more crazy, curious questions. Thanks for watching.